for joining us for our final panel, followed by our final poetry session. These people have presented here before. I was just teasing them at lunch that they put this other person on their panel named Lena. I'm starting to think she's mythological. But they said they could fill up their time talking about dead animals longer.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Just more.
And we've been so inspired by all the PowerPoints that we created a last-minute PowerPoint. So Lena, even if she might be mythical, but in her place is a PowerPoint, and who doesn't want to be replaced by a PowerPoint? I'm Sara Vereen, and I'm just gonna present this panel, contextualize it, and then I'll read. Often when we talk about the natural world and when we write about the natural world, we tend to think of the world that is alive, right? The living, or even the threatened. But we don't as often talk about the destroyed or the dead. What has already been lost. But as anyone who's ever come across death in the natural world, be it a raised forest or roadkill, or even evidence of the natural world, right? Sort of a mounted buck. You know that those moments of the natural world now still are now dead, give us a sense. They speak to understanding of what is wild and what it means to be part of the world as wild. And so they're signifying bodies in the same way that live animals and nature in its alive state is. We've started with a dead sperm whale, even though none of us are going to talk about a dead sperm whale, because for me, I started off being a writer as a journalist, and I worked in this very small island in Florida, and one of my assignments one time was to go cover the dead sperm whale that had washed up on shore. And I think it was one of the first times that I was really wowed by nature, because it was enormous, right? And its death became a spectacle, and also became representative of what was lost. And in this picture, you can see the way in which that spectacle is there, right? Where it's not only the still body of what was once living, but now it's being captured in a photograph, and there's a little boy sort of posing beside it. So we're all going to read nonfiction, creative nonfiction work, short essays that are exploring this idea of what does it mean to understand the wild or the natural world via what's no longer alive or wild. We're going to start with Kendra. Wait, this is our PowerPoint. It's really complicated and exciting. So in case you can't see who we are, we also have our pictures up there. So I'm going to read Kendra's bio, and then we'll proceed as we go forward. So Kendra Green is the author of the Icelandic museum trilogy Anatomy of Museum, The Stone Collector, and the forthcoming Vagrants and Uncommon Visitors. She began her museum career adhering text to the wall, one vinyl letter at a time. Then the University of Iowa gave her an MFA in nonfiction, a graduate certificate in book arts, and the opportunity to costume a giant ground sloth in its Museum of Natural History. She's been a Fulbright grantee, a Jacob K. Jevitz Fellow, and most recently writer in residence at the Dallas Museum of Art's Center for Creative Connections. She's vaccinated wild boars in Chile and met the devil both on the road in Argentina and at a bookstore in Dallas. Her artist books are held in collections as far away as Qatar. Her zines appear in the White Rock Zine Machine for 25 cents a pop. So we'll start with Kendra. Please give her a round of applause.
All right, so for context, the Icelandic Museum trilogy has 2 chapbooks in it so far. The next one's coming out this summer. You'll be hearing from Vagrants and Uncommon Visitors today. And is it the arrow, Sara? And it's illustrated by a remarkable writer who is trained as a field biologist, and so I got very, very lucky. The only things you might need to know is that this is in Iceland, And the full piece would tell you about how a museum comes to be, but the foregrounding should speak for itself. Their grandmother was blind. She hadn't always been, but as the glaucoma took her sight, she would ask, each day, what birds were on the water. The farm where they lived was a farm with a shoreline, a piece of land poking into the great wide lake. Half the year the lake froze over, and sometimes mist blew through, or clouds of midges swarmed up. But every day she asked, and every day they told her. There might be 20 species to report on in a given day. More, maybe. The short-eared owl and the long-tailed duck, the red-throated loon or the black-headed gull, the white-tailed eagle or the purple sandpiper, the common redshank or the ruddy turnstone. And any of the kids might answer, but probably it was Sigurgeir especially, who would be the one to tell her. The family farm was settled in 1888. It's called Ytri Neslundum, meaning the Northern Peninsula, named for its position on the lake, and it remains one of Lake Mivad's 24 traditional family farms. It has a house and a cowshed and a smoke shed and another shed for drying either fish or laundry as the need may be, and what might have once been a barn but is now nothing short of a mechanic's garage, complete with a pin-up girl calendar and a hydraulic lift and a 74 Monte Carlo that needs work. Sigurgeir was born on the farm in 1962. He was one of 3 brothers and 4 sisters here on the farm with sheep and cows and chickens and 1 horse and 1 dog and always a bed of rhubarb. They made an honest effort to grow potatoes. These 7 kids, like all farmers' kids around the lake, grew up collecting eggs, collecting shells. Sigurgeir had a friend 1 farm over, and they went collecting together. And as you collected eggs, you'd trade them, like baseball cards, your divers for their shorebirds. The rule of collecting eggs is a solemn and simple even split. You take half for you and half for the nest. You could take fewer, I suppose, but whatever you do, there is a threshold. You never leave less than 4 eggs in a nest. In some families, the code is stricter, never less than 5. And if you're struggling with the math of survival, wondering how one arrives at the number 4 as the standard of husbandry, consider that there is an upper limit, too. The birds themselves can't manage more than 12 eggs, simply can't warm any more than that snugged in the down of their bird bodies. You pull eggs from different species at different times. Each has their own clock. Still, the whole of egg collecting lasts not much more than 1 month a year. It ends, of course, when there are not eggs, but goslings and cygnets and whatever you call baby black-tailed godwits. But it begins, by one reckoning, when you mix chalk in water, and if a potato floats, well, then it's time to take the eggs. For a while then, it's eggs for baking and eggs for omelets, eggs for as long as they last. Eggs dipped in chalk or ash at the smokehouse. Each species of eggs tastes different, of course, but no matter their flavor, split from their shells, all of them look the same. Different in scale, perhaps, more or less albumin, but always those intense, dark yolks like orange suns. Lake Mivad is full of life, excessively, abundantly so, eutrophic, as the scientists say. The lake is named for the midges that swarm prodigiously in summer, thickly, like weather, trapped buzzing in your hair, or else their bodies wet lumps stuck to the back of your throat, or lodged irretrievably up your nostrils, or caught in your eye, and eventually blinked out like a black tear. In the far east of the country, there are signs in the bathrooms announcing, "We do not have geothermal heat. Please use hot water sparingly." By the time you arrive some hours later in Mivat, in the eastern half and northern third of the country, Your approach has been marked by a succession of wide rivers and waterfalls, and eventually cracks in the earth venting steam. In Mivat, you go to fill your water bottle, and someone suggests, maybe use the cold, or else the water will have a smell. It is spring water that feeds the lake, and the nutrients in the spring water feed a bounty of aquatic insects, notably the midges, and the insects feed whatever will swallow them down, though most notably the ducks. The visitor center announces, nowhere in the world are there so many species of duck in the same place. For the record, that makes 13 the number to beat, or sometimes you'll read 14. But in any case, it's all the duck species that appear in Iceland, minus the 2 species spotted strictly on the coast. There are both Eurasian and North American ducks here. There are both Arctic species and boreal. There are dabbling ducks and diving ducks, not to mention 1,500 pairs of Eurasian widgeon. And there's the horned grebe, too, a red-eyed migrator that breeds in Iceland, a bird that makes a floating nest of rotting marsh, but nonetheless tethers that nest to surrounding plants, that it may rise and fall with the current, but not be swept away. When Sigurður turned 17, he got a driver's license and a car, a blue Toyota Lancer, what an old friend still remembers as, quote, a very strong, good car. He was the kind of guy who would give you a lift, so you'd call him. It can be hard to get around the wetlands, but there he was, so affable about it. And he would drive 150 kilometers for a dance without even thinking about it. He'd make a couple of trips to get everyone there, if that's what it took. There is no national dance in Iceland. It's just not a form of expression. Perhaps because dances were outlawed for a time, a few centuries back, legislated away in a society where it was understood you couldn't get married unless you had enough money. And so certain people married late, or not at all. But the thing about dances was that they brought people together, and you ended up with babies whether everyone was married or not. And so, from the 12th century to the 17th, it was just safer not to dance. Not that the babies stopped. Not that the young people at Sigurdur's dances would have danced a national dance had they had one. Not when there was Michael Jackson. Things change, of course. The waxwing didn't used to be in Iceland at all, but now they're laying here. The Tufted Duck, one of the divers, only came to Iceland at the end of the 19th century and is now the most common duck species to be found. When Sigurður was 20, a great heron, a foreign bird to Iceland, landed one farm over and was shot by the farmer. It happens from time to time, a non-native arrival. Happens not just here, but anywhere. Birds caught up in storms, birds blown out to sea, birds pulled by a current and washed up on the wrong shore. Though perhaps it's not always some unaccountable intervention. Or at least maybe, sometimes, it is no one thing alone that shears a few individuals away from the territory they know, sends them on their eccentric orbit, away from the rest of the flock. In the language of ornithology, birds are classed by their abundance in 5 descending steps: common, less common, uncommon, rare, and vagrant. The first 4 classes have to do with certainty, with whether you can absolutely depend on seeing a bird in suitable habitat and proper season, or if you might have to wait 2 or 5 years between sightings. But vagrants are more rare than rare. Vagrants are out of their normal range. Vagrants have appeared somewhere new. Which is to say, you may have a common migrant or an uncommon visitor, and to some degree predict their comings and goings. But a vagrant is so unusual, there is no reason to expect them at all. The farmer put the heron he'd shot in the freezer. Perhaps because he was waiting. Perhaps because he had made an irrevocable decision and now did not know what to do. Perhaps because there was room in the freezer and all the time in the world. I assume he folded the legs like collapsing an umbrella, folded the beak to the neck and the neck to the body. What we know is that one day, when Sigurður was at that neighbor's farm, the farmer showed the bird to him. What was there to say at this first sighting? What did they know then? The farmer made a gift of the bird that had no precedent, that shouldn't have been here in the first place. Sigurður accepted the frozen 4 pounds, 5 maybe, took the heron to a taxidermist on the seacoast in Dalvik. This was his first stuffed bird. If a collection is a colony, this is how this one began. 400 people live around Lake Mývatn. That's not so small as Icelandic towns go, pretty average really. And even though this population is spread out, a loop well suited to the marathon course staged here once a year, it is still a town too small for secrets. Which is to say, when you come to take an interest in dead birds, it will be known. You will start to get calls. You will get calls from all around the lake, calls from the neighbors, calls from anyone actually, whenever there is something you really should come see. Maybe the taxidermist called when the heron was ready. Or maybe Sigurður just stopped in the next time he was passing through. Maybe stopped by a few times, knew the heron would be waiting eventually. I wouldn't give the first pickup much thought, except that something happened. When Sigurður returned to Dalvik for the great heron, he was moved to purchase 2 more birds from the shop, a puffin and a Northern Fulmar. The Northern Fulmar looks like a snub-nosed seagull, the head clean white, as if that was the part you held onto while dip-dyeing the rest of the bird in washes of weak gray ink. 250 years ago, the only known colony of Northern Fulmars in the whole Atlantic was a single colony here in northern Iceland. Now there are hundreds of colonies, thousands of birds, including colonies in the Faroes and British Isles. The species is now spread so far and wide, perhaps because this relative of the albatross knows so cunningly how to scavenge the scraps of fishing boats and whaling ships plowing the northern Atlantic waves. It is a bird shaped like a gull, though it glides like a shearwater. It begins breeding, quote, at an exceptionally old age. But perhaps that is only because it is one of the longest-lived birds we know. A puffin is a bird built like a bullet. Even its wings are compact, look dense for all their feathers and hollow bones. Its feet are safety cone orange, its face painted in harlequin surprise, a bird that never stops flapping its wings in flight, never soars or glides, but beats frantically, unceasingly, its expression a constant shock that any of this is working out at all. But all these concessions of flight so that it might dive. It dives deep and plunging, tracing sharp down-up V shapes and wide-troughed U's and wily, wandering double-dip W's. They surface with fish that hang out of their beaks like silver mustaches, a flop-fluttering fringe. But when taxidermists pose them, they neither dive, nor swim, nor madly beat their wings. They stand on rocks, much as they do in life, looking down at their feet with an air of bewilderment, or staring at the horizon, beaks lifted, their bearing almost noble. The Northern Fulmar is among the most common species to be found on Iceland's coasts. The puffin is represented so widely in shops catering to tourists that the Icelanders call these gift shops puffin shops. When Sigurður selected the puffin and the Northern Fulmar to take home with the great heron, he mixed the coastal with the inland, the common with the vagrant. And in picking this pairing of Icelandic icons, he matched an unwitting pair of complements. If the puffin is a study in high contrast, the Northern Fulmar is all grayscale gradation. If the puffin is struggle and drop, the Northern Fulmar is fluid and glide. And if the Northern Fulmar represents the prosperity of prodigious expansion, the puffin, I am sorry to report, suggests something shifting and uncertain. If you grew up on the opposite side of the island, in Heimaey, on the only inhabited island in the Vestmannaeyjar island chain off the southwest coast, you would have had an August ritual. You would have gone out at dusk, stayed out into the night. You would have gone out with friends and family away from town and towards the cliffs. Pufflings hatch in their nests on the cliffs, and when it is their time to leave, they tumble out towards the water. For the most part, they bump along the cliff face or flutter in free fall until at last the surface of the water holds them up. But sometimes they are blown back onto land. The winds meeting the cliff are fierce. Often the pufflings try again, but sometimes they wander towards the lights of town. Which is why the children of Jaime would go out with cardboard boxes to scoop them up and wait until daylight and then fling them back off the cliff. Any grown-up person on the island remembers, will light up recalling how it was. Like a month of Halloweens, like a month-long Easter egg hunt. But the children now go out only a night or two. The ocean water has been warming, and the food source is relocating, and there just aren't that many pufflings to find there anymore. Not only were there two sources of birds, the lake and the shop. In time, there were two taxidermists, too, to fuel Sigurgeir's collecting. Steingrimur Thorsteinsson in Dalvik and Sigurður Gudmundsson on the way in Akureyri. In any number of ways, the collection evidences a kind of twinning, a kind of split, a doubling like a reflection in the water. When Sigurgeir chose the puffin and the Northern Fulmar to accompany the great heron home, he set a precedent, and his collection now is like a balanced scale. Half of it birds Sigurgeir brought in from the lake, and half of it birds that could have come from anywhere, but were nonetheless birds he first laid eyes on in a taxidermist shop. I don't know why it should matter, birds from the lake or birds from the shop, but it was somehow shocking when I heard it. I had assumed there was something in the ritual, that it was a collection not just of dead birds, but of dead birds collected around this lake, a collection of all those phone calls and all those farmers' freezers and all those pounds of flesh. Indeed, I had at first assumed that Sigurgeir was himself a taxidermist, that the collection meant so much to his family because it was his work, precocious and prodigious, done there on the farm in a little shed. But what Sigurgeir did was a different kind of making. It was not his hand that mattered, but his eye. And surely every museum is a museum of selection, a museum of choices made. But here the how of collecting seems not to matter. The source of a thing does not matter. It is the thing that matters in its own right, and that shouldn't shock me. Surely it shouldn't. But when was collecting ever just about things? Thank you. Next up, you will be treated to Clinton Crockett Peters. He is the author of Pandora's Garden, Kudzu, Cockroaches, and Other Misfits of Ecology, forthcoming from the University of Georgia Press. He has an MFA in Nonfiction from the University of Iowa, where he was an Iowa Arts Fellow, and is pursuing a PhD in English and Creative Writing at the University of North Texas. He is the recipient of Shenandoah's Tom Carter Prize, Nonfiction Prize, North American Review's Torch Prize for Creative Nonfiction, Columbia, a Journal of Literature and Arts Writing Award, and an award from the Society for Professional Journalists. He has essays and fiction appearing in Orion, Fourth Genre, Diagram, The Rumpus, Southwest Review, Hunger Mountain, Hotel America, Waxwing, Southern Review, The MacGuffin, Iron Horse Literary Review, woot woot, The Dallas Observer, and the Denton Record Chronicle, among others.
Hey, gang. This is an essay in progress. One of the things I've loved about Sal is the feedback I've gotten on my stuff that always needs work. I always need work on everything. So keep that in mind, but obviously judge me harshly. So the title itself is a work in progress. Right now it's called The Prairie Dog Guru, but I don't think that's actually what I want to call it. When you get to the end, you'll see. One thing you should know, I guess, about there's my image.
There you go.
Yeah. That one's me. That one's Kendra, and then that's Sara. So I guess the essay is too long to read in its entirety, even with Lena gone. And I'm going to read, I guess, the first 10 or 9 pages, and then I'm just going to skip right to the ending, just so you can see sort of what ideas I'm trying to coalesce with. And I guess I'll tell you what happens in the part that I'm skipping over after we've heard the beginning. So right now it's called The Prairie Dog Guru. Not happy with it. So we'll see. Maybe I'll just call it Prairie Dogs or something. So anyway, The Prairie Dog Guru. In the driveway of a farmhouse outside Lubbock, Texas, Linda Watson greets me with a grimace smile, short gray hair, and a dust-covered banana slug yellow T-shirt that reads, "Recycle Prairie Dogs." "Filthy creatures," she says, cocking her head towards her house. "I never go in there." She refers not to rodents, but to college-bound men who rent her home, now covered in garbage. And instead of visiting these board-shorted tenants, Linda has chosen to wilt for 10 hours in the Texas July sun, sticking her hands into darkened burrows and retrieving rodents who reward her by trying to tear her fingers off. In a profile, the Houston Chronicle once called Linda, quote, "a random figment of the social order." Watson, 66, claims to have rescued about 2,000 prairie dogs a year for the last 32 years, which would put her at rescuing more prairie dogs than any other person in the world. A few weeks ago on the phone, in response to requests to tag along with her, she said, "As long as you can shut up and pay attention, we'll get along. Because the minute I put my hands on an animal, I'm responsible for him. The mission is him, and not spreading your words. Honest to God, I don't give a rat's ass about your story." Prairie dogs, like the black-tailed one Linda saves in Texas, hail from the squirrel family, 5 species which burrow from Mexico to Saskatchewan. Their homes resemble a dirt version of McDonald's playground, tunneled matrices that descend 30 feet, spaces inside for bedrooms, bathrooms, a foyer, and nurseries for the blind, bald fetuses. For their labors digging these underground mansions, prairie dogs are rewarded by rattlesnake invasions, burrowing owls, and black-footed ferrets. Those populations depend on a diet of rodent meat. All told, up to 89 species depend on prairie dogs, and for this, scientists dub them a keystone species. They are like coral, habitat, and food. "I've come to believe," Watson said to me once, "that there's no prairie without prairie dogs." Which makes it interesting to me how much they are hated throughout the American West. The usual responses for this, as to why they are hated, are just rodenthood, and that burros break cattle legs, though the scientific veracity of the latter is debatable. Colorado State studies them and has indicated that prairie dog can actually increase cattle yields because burros aerate soils, massaging and loosening hard earth, allowing parched land to drink in water. Despite this, some hunters nab 400 rodents a day, 8,000 a year. Usually control methods include drowning, dynamiting, burrow ripping, bait poisoning, and fumigants. Also the blocking of holes and shoving inside aluminum phosphate cartridges that explode underground, a veritable gas chamber. One man who goes by the name Mr. Dog, profiled by Mother Jones in 2000, said he preferred a Remington 222, claiming to have bulleted 75 straight ones before missing. The sport of rodent hunting, also called varminting, is an old one, profiled in movies such as Winter's Bone, and has been a way to sustain a meager existence for hundreds of years. And it's also a fun way to kill things. "Can you hear it go plop?" Mr. Dog asked the Jones reporter. Switching on YouTube, you can find hosts of compilation videos, yearly roundups of the best prairie dog kills, the rodents cartwheeling, mid-air dismembering, squealing, prairie dogs gunned up and down and sideways. There's even a Varmint Hunters Association with its magazine that says "for shooters, by shooters." Their website has laid claim to a circulation in 37 countries. My story, though Linda Watson said she wasn't interested in it, is that I'm a former owner of a prairie dog and also grew up in Lubbock. The late 90s and early 2000s, when I owned my prairie dog, was an interesting time. In addition to all the fumigating and varmint hunting, in 2004, the CDC and FDA banned prairie dogs as pets, and the city of Lubbock began killing scores of them because it was convinced, erroneously, that the rodents were responsible for poisoning groundwater. I gave my prairie dog the ironic name Squirrel, and her friendly attitude didn't disappoint. She was about the size of 2 fists, short-fuzzed, mouse-smelling, vocal. She greeted me after school from her 6-foot-tall cage with a rearing of hind legs, arch back, kind of like that, and a high-pitched squeal reminiscent of two plucked violin strings. Biologists call this the prairie dog's jump yip. It's the sound Squirrel greeted me with for 9 years. She welcomed me from pubescence until I was in my 20s. Like many adolescents, keeping a mammalian life allowed me to practice the awkwardness of social biological kinships. Squirrels comforted me, jostling me out of quotidian anxieties, made it hard to hold a harsh view of the universe. It's hard to be spiteful for too long when an ambient fur squeak toy wants to crawl up your leg and go to sleep on your lap. I'd mentioned on the phone to Linda that I once cared for a prairie dog while I grew up in Lubbock, and I laid bare my bias, hoping to share a kind of interspecies bond. A quick Google search will reveal all the ways to kill them, the proper poisons, the gun ranges where people have fur targets instead of paper, and Linda's gruff way of saying after we'd hung out, "Well, you're not so terrible." I think she came to see we had a similar outlook, though my hands were far less scarred. And I think in meeting her, I wanted to talk with somebody who could help illuminate why anybody would have a hating bias towards a thing when others would crawl out of that same borough, the same town, the same Lubbock, with a completely different view. 60 prairie dogs are cooped inside Linda's skylit shed, which when we walk in smells like cat meal food processed with mold. Against a wall stand stacks of metal cages. The prairie dogs flutter about the mesh like birds. Wood shavings and turds kick into the air. As I near a larger animal, it rears on its haunches and lets out a squeak that sends a jolt of memory through me. Linda pries open a cage and tosses in a plate of chopped carrots and cucumbers. Some animals scurry from her hand, others hunch and eat, and one she lets her stroke its back, tail, haunches, and ears. They do make good pets, she agrees. As we leave, Linda switches on a radio. As long as it's not religious, they like it, she says. I want to take a moment here and reveal one reason I think is behind prairie dog animus. In 2004, the same year prairie dogs were banned, George W. Bush won re-election, and Lubbock, Texas, was the second most conservative county by votes in the country. This was front page news in my hometown. Many small religious-minded cities claim that they have the most churches per capita, but I wager Lubbock could put in a run for number one. And if I may weave a dangerous blanket statement from growing up in this culture, it's that people of this persuasion do not take to wildlife, and when they do, it is often to shoot them. One reason for this might be the vestige of Puritanism, that witch-hunting, scarlet-letter-sewing, violent belief in holy perfection. It's destructive because it defines purity by what it is not and privileges the absence of others. If one's soul, environment, or home were a plate, that surface must be wiped clean, sinners and prairie dogs, despite whatever suffering might occur. Puritanical animus is not restricted to prairie dogs, of course. David Viren, in his book Beast in the Garden, catalogs the history of America's bloody confrontation with creatures coast to coast. Predators are well known for historically driving men to guns, politicians to poison. So much lay outside of colonists' control: the weather, soil, invisible microbes. Predator hunts or prairie dog burrow dynamiting were within human sway. I'm not sure how much has changed. So much of life seems beyond reason or manufacturing. Other creatures can receive pent-up frustrations, projections of hostility because they cannot communicate back. Even my us versus them setup here feels like a vestige of Puritanism, my frustrations with my home. Except some people like Linda seem to have been able to hear prairie dogs all along, understand their jump yips. Linda, raised in the same community as many prairie dog enemies, now takes it as her mission to save as many as she can. We walked to Linda's Chevy Silverado, parked in a dusty and mesquite-shaded expanse of her backyard. The truck bed is filled with cages, a cooler of bottled water, and Dial dish soap. The truck is hitched to a trailer hauling a rusty 500-gallon tank. The tank is leading water as if bladder shot. Why Dial? Bubbles, Linda tells me, panics prairie dogs into thinking they're drowning before they actually are. Watson gauges that soap isn't healthy, but neither is extermination with toxic poison. While we're talking, Watson's assistant, Luke, wheels up in another truck. Luke is 6 feet tall with the farmer tan skin, beer belly, soft voice, and pale goatee. He made friends with Linda 30 years ago, and since retiring, he's worked for her, scooping up prairie dogs and driving because Linda can't with her bad depth perception. I can't sit around all day watching TV, Luke says. My retirement is prairie dogs. He claims he's seen Linda give mouth-to-mouth once to a drowned prairie dog by wrapping her lips around its snout. He says, shaking his head in disbelief, she's the Prairie Dog Guru. Nobody knows more about prairie dogs than she does. West of Lubbock lies a now closed Air Force Base turned community college, truck driving school, hovercraft testing site, sail cart racetrack, and technology center. Reese's administrators decided a few years ago that all animals were welcome on its grassy property, provided they didn't overrun the place, which they have. As we drive up, I look out the window, and it looks like plenty has rung amok on the base besides animals. Old barracks stand with collapsed rotten roofs and patched up eaves, broken windows. The grass is ankle deep in sage, swarmed with mating dragonflies. An antiquated air control tower suffers vines spiraling up its paint-chipped stairs. Last year, Linda spotted eagles here, 4 or 5 species of fox, coyotes, skunks, raccoons, and of course burrowing owls, which can't exist without tunneling prairie dogs. Linda aims a finger at a less than foot-tall owl standing sentry over its bunker. There's a whole family there, she says, living like they're supposed to. As we drive around, the sun glowing over everything, the glass lining up like the military once housed here. Beaming at the wild, Linda looks content, stoic, her skin a deep tan, her eyes peeled at the ground. As the world's most famous prairie dog rescuer, Linda has received armadas of press, and for a short time, I guess true for everyone, minor celebrity status in Japan. What is amazing for me, perhaps, among a list of fantastic attributes, is her level of success in the misogynist world of ranching and animal husbandry. Before prairie dogs, Watson mastered the art of breaking horses, training mules, and livestock trading, all after dropping out of junior high. She was born in 1954 as Linda Hatfield, her parents on a 30-acre farm outside Lansing, Michigan. She was born with eyes rolled into her sockets, requiring corrective surgery and a lifetime of bad sight. Her cheekbones were formed too narrow with no incisors. Ironically, these are the same teeth that prairie dogs grow throughout their lives and use to gnaw grass and sometimes Linda's fingers. Linda matured among 2 alcoholic parents who held glass-smashing, door-slamming, oath-taking all-night fights. Watson describes her youth as, quote, redneck, blue-collar, and trash. She said that her clothes stunk most of the time, and because her daddy was a hunting guide, other than alcoholic gymnastics, he was absent for their trailer for long stretches. Outside of school and training horses, Linda trapped small animals around her farm. Many, she said, she let go. I gamble this is where an understanding grew, a kinship with something small, trapped, trying to survive, broken by historical circumstances beyond their choosing. After dropping out of school, Linda married at 16. She later admitted her husband was an escape, as marriage often can be in isolated communities and bitter families. Her husband was a military man who got shipped to Reese Air Force Base, this same one where she would later let me tag along as she rescued prairie dogs. Reese is what brought Linda to Lubbock, and the rodents have what has kept her occupied ever since. She became pregnant on base, had a son, but he died 9 months later from the same genetic defects Linda had been born with. She divorced her husband when she realized his alcoholic abuse was just what she'd been trying to leave behind. Linda hated Texas at first, the heat, dust, barrenness, the heat, the dust, sweeping into shut windows, the heat, the dust, piling into drifts, the dryness and summer after summer. But divorced, she had to work and only had experience with animals. She groomed dogs, worked, and was fired from feedlots because she refused to conform to male stereotypes and lechery. She also drank a lot of whiskey. At some point, she met an ancient trapper who still caught rodents with his hands, a dying, almost extinguished breed even in the 1970s. This trapper had the idea of beginning selling the furry, dying creatures as pets. Linda fires a cigarette up with one of the half-dozen lighters scattered across the dash of her truck. Luke pops the curb, dragging the water tank trailer behind it into unkept grass. Several micro-volcanoes erupt from the earth, and with them barking prairie dogs, warning of the storm that has come. Linda cracks the door of her truck open and, without warning, runs out as it's still moving. She does this, she tells me later, because the rodents are smart enough to know that when they hear the truck, to escape into the deepest parts of her den. So time is critical. She jogs behind her burrow and raises a fist when her trailer's water tank is in position. Luke crushes the brake and we lurch forward. In the back, Linda drops to her knee, padded by a slice of turquoise foam, the one thing about her that looks out of place in the hardened near-desert landscape. Linda pries open the tank's water spout. The flood begins. Luke squeezes amber soap from an Ajax bottle into the stream. Linda leans back, bracing her hands at the opening, stretched like a spider spanning its hole. We wait, foam bubbling from 2 neighboring burrows. A panicked dog shoots from the ground. Snake quick, Linda fires her hand at the dog's throat, pinching its jaws closed. The furry bundle twitches and kicks in a fur tornado. Linda hands the rodent to Luke, who grabs it by the tail. He dangles the animal upside down, draining the soap and water. The dog goes still, zonked like a shark flipped on its belly. Luke then drops the soaped critter into a cage in front of the water tank, while Linda waits for another rodent to emerge. And here's where I'm going to skip. So there's like more stuff with Linda. We do some more rescuing. She gets bit on the hand like really badly, and that's like part of her job. But I wanted to skip to the end. So I wanted to see like what's the aftermath. But the truth is, like, she can't tell me where she takes these dogs because it's like super controversial. So like 85% of the people who she like delivers the dogs to make her sign a non-disclosure agreement, right? Because they don't want their neighbors to know that they're like bringing these things into their land that a lot of people are like trying to kill off. So, but the one place she said it could go is Caprock Canyon State Park, which is, you know, public land, and they're very open about what they've been doing with prairie dogs as well as buffaloes. I'm sure a lot of you know. So I went there. I hung out with this guy named CL. CL is a very cool guy, and the backstory that isn't in this ending is that he was not on board with this prairie dog relocation at all. He was a 4th generation Texan. You know, his grandparents, his parents just were not into prairie dogs, so he was really against this. But he kind of fell in love with this one prairie dog that he called Tripod because it had 3 legs, right? And it was a mom, and it like gave birth, and it was like this thing. So he kind of came around, right? So I hung out with CL, we walked and looked around at some of the prairie dogs, and then he starts talking, and there's the ending. So the work was not hard, CL says, just he and Linda and about 4 other park employees and a tractor auger. Now perhaps 40 dogs fill this man-made colony. The only time they were fed was the first year because of the effects of a drought when winter found the new colony ground barren. That time, Linda drove in with a truckload of sweet potatoes. CL pulls into a way in the back primitive camping site my friends and I preferred when I was going camping in high school because of its seclusion. CL tells me a story about 15 years ago, right when I began visiting the park. CL crossed the fenceless land between his property and the park's dressed in camouflage. He shouldered a rifle for hunting and binoculars. As he topped the hill overlooking the Red Rock Canyon, he espied a group of teenagers below. Quote, hippie-looking with long hair. Sounds familiar. He says, smoking weed. He found it glorious to spy on these lawbreakers, to know that he was looking down on a group that had no idea they were being watched. I didn't find this story creepy at all, and I started to laugh because it easily could have been me and my friends. I had long hair from that time and still do. Something about the possible encounter and re-encounter with CL, sharing in the laughter and joy of nosing into the privacy of delinquents, that our world's urban and rural, liberal, conservative, evangelist, and hunter were so much closer than I had made out, that the media defines that is not a part of our binary discourse. The land connecting his experience and mine, like prairie dog burrows connected unseen underground. When I was a teenager, I thought the land above the crest of the canyon was terra incognita, the boundary of the earth, just like I often catch myself with someone who categorically differs from me and drawing them in my mind as my enemy, as the other, the vestiges of Puritanism, as strong in conservatism, liberals, and me, and all it took was CL to work in a park that imported prairie dogs and to become affected by a 3-legged mother, and all it took for me was talking with him. There are terrors in the conceived world, in the conceived chaos of the world, but then there are assurances that instability equals fluidity. Perceptions alter, animals can change in the minds of their beholders just like people with their ideas of themselves. Our worlds are connected by ecotones where our memories and personalities blend into indistinguishable features. CL remembers stumbling upon a group of pot-smoking hippies. I recall being enthralled in a landscape where I mistakenly thought we were all alone. And that's how it ends so far. Do you guys want to know about Sara? Yeah. Okay. Sara Vereen, my good friend, is the author of the forthcoming essay collection, Mine, winner of the River Teeth Literary Nonfiction Book Prize. She's also the translator of the Argentine novella Cordoba Skies by Federico Falco from Plowshare Solos in 2016. That's awesome. Her poetry and prose have appeared in Agni, the Iowa Review, Gettysburg Review, Tri-Quarterly, and other magazines. She holds an MFA from the University of Iowa and a PhD from Texas Tech. Starting this fall, she will be assistant professor of creative writing and literature at Arizona State University. Please welcome Sara Vereen.
Thank you. Thanks. I want to thank Diane for this conference. This is my third time doing this conference. The first time, I think I just stumbled in. Somebody needed somebody to read, and I'm really glad I did because it's my favorite conference. It's really lovely. And so anyways, my first conference, I offered up an option. I said I can either read an essay about murder ballads or one about a dead possum. And the audience chose murder ballads. So now I'm coming back and I'm reading about the dead possum. So I had, this essay is about finding a dead possum, as you can imagine. And it's also a little bit about the sleep deprivation that comes with having children. And appropriately, my child that I write about in this essay just woke us up last night from a nightmare, even though she's 4. So I have sleep deprivation again, so I apologize. It's engaged with 2 poems, but I'm not sure. I was going to try to read them. I don't think we have time, but I'll talk about them and explain them. So one's a poem by William Stafford and the other by Gerald Stern. So this is called My Possum. After 3 days of not sleeping, at least not really, I take my dog with me after dinner to dump a bag of garbage out back. I'm not sleeping because we have a baby girl, and suddenly she's not sleeping. She wakes every night with an animal-like fury, thrashing her body and refusing to be still. And after 3 days of this, Marta and I are both slightly addled. So when I unlatch the door to the back alley, I do not at first believe what I see. A long tail like a beetroot, fur that sinks near the chest, tiny gnats orbiting open eyes. It does not seem possible that a possum could be as big as a dog, or that it could have just died like that, right there where I need to walk. And for the briefest of moments, I am convinced that someone has left it there as a warning. But then Finn, my dog, begins to sniff at the limp body, and I call him off, throw out our trash, and hurry back inside, yelling, "You'll never believe what decided to up and die in our backyard." A friend of mine is going through a divorce, and we chat about it on the phone a day or 2 before I find the possum. She tells me it's gotten messy. "He's crazy," she says, "really crazy. Our friends think it might be the rat urine." She pauses, then probably for dramatic effect adds, "Did I tell you there are rats in our walls?" She had not told me. She lives in East Texas, and I live in West Texas, and where she lives, she says, wall rat infestations are not uncommon. Hers showed up right when she and her husband were trying to work things out, or when she was at least. But then the rats invaded the walls, and the whole house smelled like rat piss for weeks. Her husband said it was driving him crazy. "Some people just can't stand the ammonia," she tells me. "It didn't bother me or the kids, but he just couldn't take it. He moved out. It was his excuse to finally leave." A team of rodent specialists came and removed the rats, the rat nests, and the rat piss, and rebuilt my friend's walls. But even then, her husband wouldn't move back in. He never moved back in. In a month, they'll be divorced. Rats, like possums, are unlikable animals, but it doesn't mean we can't feel for them. I was living in rural northern Florida, interning at a small lesbian publishing house over the summer when it happened to me. The editors had sent me and another worker to their storage shed, which was really nothing more than an old barn, to get boxes of expired tax documents down from the rafters and haul them to the landfill. The boxes had been up in the rafters so long that rats had made nests out of them, and each time we pushed a box down, a nest of baby rats came flying with it, making a splat when it hit. They were fish-like in their translucent smallness, the dead baby rats. But it wasn't them I felt for. It was their mothers, who never fell with their babies, but instead scuttled off down the rafters, their plump bodies like an accelerated heart rate. My internship was unpaid. I had taken it to get professional experience, but that day, watching those rat mothers scurry away after the babies had fallen splat, that was the only experience I've kept with me some 15 years later. When I check on the dead possum later that night, it's still there, still dead. So I ask Facebook what I should do, as we all do. Someone, a semi-friend who knows more about dead possums than me, tells me I should call animal control. I look up the number for animal control and see that it's now called Animal Services, and somehow this makes me feel more hopeful. To serve is so much kinder than to control. And so the next morning I phone Animal Services, and the woman who answers tells me that she'll get someone out as soon as possible to take care of my possum. I think to correct her, I simply found the possum. It's not mine, but I realize that it's more mine than anyone else's. It's me who found it, and it's my number the Animal Services worker will call when he arrives and needs to locate the dead possum and take care of it. Another expression that also gives me pause. How do you take care of a dead possum? Several other sort of friends from Facebook answer my question about the possum with a joke. They tell me to keep my back door shut or run or give the dead possum a cookie. They post recipes for southern possum stew and suggest barbecuing it. I believe this is why some women marry men, a lesbian friend commented. And I pictured a broad-shouldered man with bulldozer hands picking up my possum and throwing it into the dumpster out back. This is the do-it-yourself way of taking care of a dead possum. But I have a wife, and neither of us has bulldozer hands. And even if we did, we're too exhausted from not sleeping to do anything as constructive as take care of a possum. A real friend of mine tells me about the time she tried to save a dying squirrel. Her story is prompted by my story of the dead possum. Dead animal stories are contagious like that. I went to the barn, she says, and got out the horse salve to put on a mangled squirrel that the dogs had gotten hold of. But when she tried the doctor, the injured squirrel, it clamped down on her finger with its tiny teeth. She still has a scar. Beady-eyed shithead, she adds. This is the way you talk if you grow up somewhere where there's horse salve, as my friend did. She lived on a farm in Ohio and spent her summers playing with animals in the ditch that ran between her house and the farm to Market Road. If you're like me, though, and you grew up in a college town in the Midwest, and later a coastal city in Florida, and later cities in Texas, and more college towns in the Midwest, you have very few encounters with wild animals outside of a zoo. The only live birth you will have seen was your wife's when your daughter was born, and even that will have left you feeling helpless. At home, we have a small library of animal picture books, and we read them to our daughter sometimes, taking turns making the sounds for each animal featured within. We moo and ba and meow and cock-a-doodle-doo, although we speak Spanish, so we do it differently. She claps for more. Her first words, if you can call an animal sound a word, was quack. We quacked when we saw the pictures of a duck, and eventually she quacked back. What I've noticed during these months of making so many animal noises, though, is that some animals are not given a voice. The fox, for instance. When we get to that page in the book, I always make a puckered up face and sort of yap, which my daughter laughs at least. The fish sound is also hard, but not impossible. We sort of pop our lips, and soon our daughter started popping her lips back. Look, she talks fish, we say. But possums don't even get pictures in baby books. The animals we want our babies to know about are monkeys, elephants, dogs, cats, lambs, ducks, lions, tigers, and bears. Sometimes ostriches, toucans, and eagles, sometimes even skunks. But the only possums you ever see in a kid's books are the ones hanging upside down in a tree, which is something you never see in real life. And then, of course, there is the bigger question. Do possums even make a noise? You can, of course, look up anything on the internet. I look up possum noise after checking on my dead possum out back, and the internet tells me that the possum has a low, throaty growl it uses along with a hiss to protect itself. Throaty is a strange word. It reminds me of sex workers. But there are online videos of the possum noise, and it's true the growl is guttural. You could call it throaty. After watching the possum hiss and growl, I turned to other possum videos, ones with titles like One Mean Possum and Possum versus Raccoon and Killer Dog Hunts Possum. But my favorites are the more lighthearted ones, How to Catch a Cute Possum and Baby Possum Swimming and Playing Dead and more. That last video shows a baby possum in someone's backyard pool trying to swim while several kids yell in the background. Baby Possum, hello! Where are you going, Baby Possum? Their high-pitched enthusiasm for all things possum is telling. It means that our kids' books could include more possums, just like they could include rats and biting squirrels and maybe even divorce and sleeplessness and crying babies if they wanted to. Possums may be ugly, but they're not unlikable, especially baby possums in swimming pools or baby possums playing dead on command. The scientific name for playing dead is tonic immobility, but it doesn't only happen in possums. Sharks do it, and rabbits, a few snakes. Some animals decide to play dead, but the possum has no choice. Tonic immobility takes over whenever the possum is deeply frightened. If sufficiently scared, it can enter a coma state and stay there for hours. A foul-smelling green mucus leaks from its anus to scare the other animals away. That's attractive. We animals can do it too, not the green mucus, but the plain dead. We talk a lot about flight, but there is a third F, freeze. Most often you hear about it in cases of sudden violence. Victims of rape will recall feeling paralyzed and unable to act. Victims of sexual abuse too. For me, freezing is what happens in nightmares. There is someone stalking me and I want to run, but my body freezes. I am stuck to a couch and someone has come to kill me there, and just before I die for real, just before I'm murdered, I wake up, unfrozen, not dead, and no longer plain than I might be. I blink back the contours of my bedroom until the familiarity of it calms me, until somewhere in the night I hear my daughter crying. The one time I killed an animal, it wasn't a possum or a rat or a squirrel, but a cat. I was 17 and going to a coffee shop to meet someone I thought I was falling in love with. Teenage love is the opposite of tonic immobility. You feel like every cell in your body is blinking wildly. I was driving from my parents' house in the suburb toward a coffee shop in town, and the dark road was almost empty, save for what I thought was a single plastic bag tossing in the wind across the pavement that stretched out before me. The bag danced and billowed, and I thought about how tight my heart felt and wondered if this time we might brush hands or maybe even kiss, what that kiss would feel like, how our bodies would be flushed, and that is when I realized the bag was not a bag but a cat. I had no time to swerve. It sounded like a knock, a soft, thick knock. My wheels lifted for a moment over its body before settling down on the solid paved road again. The sound a dead cat makes, I will never forget that. The poet Gerald Stern once wrote a poem about finding a dead possum, though he properly called it an opossum, being from Pennsylvania and not from the South or the Midwest, where we insist on dropping the O. And this is a quote. When I got there, the dead opossum looked like an enormous baby sleeping on the road, he begins the poem, which is defiant in its refusal to see beauty in death, and has always seemed to me like the perfect response to another poem by William Stafford. In that poem, traveling through the dark, the speaker finds not a possum, but a dead, pregnant doe in the road, her baby still living inside her. Stafford's speaker is moved by the death he's found and the responsibility he suddenly has for another life. That is, he knows that if he doesn't push the deer off the road into the canyon below, another car might hit it, which might cause more death or at least destruction. But if he pushes the doe, he will also kill the baby inside her. His swerving, as he calls his hesitancy before his decision, is brief. In the end, he pushes the doe and kills the baby, but potentially saves a future human life. Stern, though, refuses to be noble in the face of death. He moves the possum off the road, but in doing so, rejects the poet's instinct to, as he writes, praise the beauty and the balance and lose myself in the immortal life stream. Instead, he just feels miserable. And in comparison to Stafford, Stern feels like a defeat. And yet his poem is the one I reread now, perhaps because his refuses to say what is right when it comes to death. When my daughter was born, we called her ardilla, Spanish for squirrel, because of the small, fluttery sound she makes when we held her in the hospital after Marta's emergency C-section. Marta was wrapped in bandages then and had got up every so often had to get up every so often to change a giant pad into which she leaked what seemed like an endless stream of blood. The hospital-issued compression socks sighed, and the IV clicked like an old grandfather clock. When new doctors or nurses came to check on Marta or our daughter, they said, "I hear baby was breech," and they said, "What a turd." Though Marta now thinks differently, I found the birth experience traumatic. The operating room was cold and her jaw trembled from the jolt of anesthesia. A curtain hung between her face and her belly, and when I peeked over as the doctors began to carve, one of the nurses scolded me. "You're not supposed to look," she said. So I held Marta's eyes instead until we heard our daughter scream. Then the nurses wheeled our baby to the nursery in her heated box while my wife lay there, her belly open, throwing up into a plastic jug. And for a moment, I remained between the two of them, unable to move. That moment of swerving was not simple, nor was my eventual decision noble. In the end, I left Marta and followed our baby, not because I loved her more. At that point, she still seemed like a wild animal to me, but because she was the weaker, smaller one. We are taught to care for the vulnerable first. I am heating up a bowl of white bean and bacon soup from the night before, and the soup is simmering when I realize that the animal services worker still hasn't called. So I go out back to check on my possum. This time I leave Finn inside. I want to get a good look. I want to make sure there isn't something green oozing from my possum's anus and to double check that those were in fact gnats around its eyes. What I really want, though, is to touch its chest and feel if it is still warm. I open the door thinking about the possibility of my possum. It is warm outside, and for a moment I don't feel as tired as I've been these past few days. I hear Finn crying for me inside, but eventually I'm far enough away that he's no longer there. And when I reach the spot where my possum had been, there is nothing there either. Grass. A few tufts of white-gray hair. I check the alleyway. There is a man throwing away bottles 2 dumpsters down, and I think to ask if he's seen a dead possum, but I don't. There are really only 2 possibilities. One is that the animal services worker has come already and found my possum on his own without calling me and taken care of it. And if that is the case, I am sad. I realize only now that I had wanted to be there when my possum was taken away. I had wanted to take part in how its story ends. The other possibility, however, is that my possum was never really dead, no matter how sure I was that it had been. And this option makes me happy. I imagine him sometime after breakfast, but before lunch, blinking away the gnats with only slight confusion, and then, as if life were never really a question, popping up on all 4s in the same spot where he had once lain so still, then sauntering off on his way, his whip beetroot tail swishing behind him. The next day, my daughter begins to sleep again, as if she had never really scared us with her fits in the night. As if we had been sleeping soundly all along and had never stopped thinking clearly about what is real and what is exhaustion. These things pulse up against each other, life and death, beginnings and endings, what we call ours, but was never really ours to begin with. Thank you.
We have 3 minutes for questions.
Can I just say thank you, Diane? I forgot to say that earlier, but I know this is a lot of work, so thank you. And thanks everyone for being here.
We do have time for questions, sorry. We have time for questions, comments?
We know you have dead animal stories of your own.
I have dead animal stories, I'll tell you later.
Okay.
I told him Stephen, he hasn't put them in his book yet. You can use them. But yeah, I appreciate that, your work, it's always interesting, scintillating, and it was okay to hear all this stuff after lunch. And someday, I'll meet Rena and don't tell her I was making jokes about her.
She'd like that.
Yeah, she would love that.
Yeah, jokes are good.
Nope. All right, thank you.